and tools for preparedness. First of all, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Andrea Governor, Deputy Executive Director Acting of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, and I am Crispin Devon, Program Director for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS. We've got up to a slightly late start, so I am going to dispense with any introductory remarks of my own and go straight into the agenda. So at this point, I'm going to call on Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel, Director of the Environmental Sustainability Division of the OECS Commission, to deliver some brief remarks.
Thank you very much, Crispin. Good morning, everyone. I want to acknowledge Ms. Elizabeth Riley, who is the Executive Director Acting of CDEMA. Also, our colleague, Ms. Denise Solis from IFRC, representatives and participants from the regional member states, OECS and broader CARICOM, who are part of the CDEMA body of states, including agencies and communities from across our member states, colleagues and friends. Pandemics, climate change, and natural disasters all emphasize the interconnection of health, environment, and socioeconomic considerations. The potential for a perfect storm of tropical cyclones, COVID-19 pandemic, and economic crisis is not only possible, but likely, based on the lingering pandemic and the grim predictions for this hurricane season. In a BBC News article published on 21st May 2020, it states, the eastern Indian city of Kolkata has been devastated by a powerful cyclone, Amphan, which has killed at least 84 people across India and Bangladesh. Thousands of trees were uprooted in the gales, electricity and telephone lines brought down, and houses flattened. It continues, coronavirus restrictions have been hindering emergency and relief efforts. COVID-19 and social distancing measures made mass evacuations more difficult, with shelters unable to be used to full capacity. End of quote. This could easily be a story from one of our CARICOM states and coastal states. It is therefore imperative that regional, national, and local systems anticipate and plan for such a scenario. I have no doubt that we can. The region has long been a shining example of resilience and adaptability, but it can only be achieved through deliberate collaboration, coordination, and ensuring of on-the-ground capacity. The OECS Commission, through our Climate and Disaster Resilience Program, is therefore pleased to partner with CDEMA and our friends from the IFRC to host and facilitate today's webinar and training on shelter management best practices and tools for preparedness. Together, we have leveraged our synergistic mandates, capacities, networks, expertise, and influence to design and deliver this forum. The registration of an attendance of scores of participants from a broad cross-section of agencies and communities from all over the region is testament to the relevance and timeliness of this initiative. Overall, the region's handling of the COVID-19 crisis has been exemplary, but not by accident, but a product of years of building our systems and capacities for responding to threats and disasters. Your presence today is further evidence to that commitment at all levels. So on behalf of Director General Dr. Lucas Jules and the entire OECS family, I extend a warm welcome and best wishes for today's sessions and reaffirm the OECS Commission's commitment to working seamlessly with the regional coordination mechanism for disaster mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Thank you so much, and wishing all a successful day.
Thank you so much, Chamberlain, for these remarks. And I will now turn to Ms. Andrea Governor, Acting Deputy Executive Director of CDEMA, to give some remarks. Andrea.
Thank you very much. Mr. Emmanuel Chamberlain, Head of the Environmental Sustainability Cluster at the OECS, Mr. Crispin Duverne, Climate and Disaster Resilient Program Director, also of the OECS, and Ms. Denise Soles, the Regional Emergency Shelter Senior Officer of the IFRC Americas. Panelists, participants, a pleasant good morning. Hurricane season 2020 made its arrival in the Caribbean at a time when the region has been grappling with a multi-hazard scenario since January 2020, starting with a drought and followed by the COVID-19 outbreak. The economic and social impact of COVID-19 in CARICOM states has been catastrophic, and the potential to rapidly transform into a humanitarian crisis has been present. CARICOM states have been able to so far blunt the curve as it relates to COVID-19, but we will need to coexist with COVID-19 for the foreseeable future, and regional solidarity is a requirement for member states to successfully emerge from this crisis. The Caribbean is often referred to as being located in the most disaster-prone area of the world. According to the Global Report on Economic Losses, Poverty and Disasters 1998 to 2017, published by Credit in 2018. For the period 1998 to 2017, hurricanes that swept through the Caribbean and made landfall on the Americas caused the greatest economic losses of all climate-related disasters, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of GDP. In fact, the heaviest cost of storms relative to the size of their economies fell on small island states in the Caribbean, and this hurricane season is now predicted to be an above average one. Shelter management in the context of a COVID-19 outbreak will present unique challenges, and the CDEMA CU supports the notion that emergency shelters provide vital spaces for impacted, vulnerable, or unhoused members of the community prior to or post to a hazard event. Certainly, this has been recognized across the region as impacted states seek to provide those basic rights of individuals as prescribed by the international human rights law. Further, international human rights law recognizes that everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living, including adequate housing, and the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights underscores that the right to adequate housing should not be interpreted narrowly, with the provision of emergency sheltering being considered therein, and thereby recognizing basic conditions within the constitution of adequate housing, and thus this should be complemented by adequate safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, energy, physical safety, and accessibility, including for disadvantaged and marginalized groups, such as the elderly, women, children, and persons with disabilities. The CDEMA CU, being cognizant of the challenges related to emergency sheltering in the region, stemming from the inadequate numbers, availability of adequate locations, lack of purpose-built structures, manpower, and the overarching impact of a hazard, acknowledges that these issues were now being compounded by the clear and present impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So on behalf, therefore, of the Executive Director of CDEMA Acting, Ms. Elizabeth Riley, as we move forward, we in the CDEMA system, we commit to providing emergency and disaster management support to the region. We will be presenting the CDEMA guidelines for emergency shelters and shelterees during COVID-19 for discussion. We are pleased to partner with the OECS Commission in delivering this extremely timely webinar as we explore what it takes to have a successful shelter management program while we treat to the COVID-19 threat and seek ways to navigate some of the potential challenges the pandemic, coupled with the Atlantic hurricane season, could potentially bring. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Andrea. And finally, for this session, I'd like to call on Ms. Denise Solly, who is the Regional Emergency Shelter Senior Officer at IFRC Americas, to make some brief remarks. Denise?
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation, for giving us the floor, for being in here. I would like to welcome and thank you for this space. Welcome to the different members that have joined us today, this morning, and also to the different members of the Red Cross movement that are in here with us. We know that for sure we need to change a little bit the type of response that we will give whenever a hurricane strikes because of COVID-19. So that's going to be one of the main topics that we're going to be discussing alongside this webinar. Thank you and welcome to everybody.
Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you for all for everyone for the opening remarks. And I will shortly hand over to my co-moderator, Andrea Governor. But before I do so, just a few guidelines. Because we get up to yesterday, we had a registration of several hundreds. So having everyone take the mic during question and answer time might be a bit difficult. So what we have at the bottom of the page, you'll see a Q&A icon. So when you click on that, you can actually type in your questions. And then those of us who are on, you know, the presenters and resource persons or the representatives of the agencies will attempt, if possible, to answer your questions. If not, the moderators will read out the questions during the question and answer sessions. So that way the questions can be tackled on, can be addressed on your behalf. So with that, I will hand over to Andrea, who will take us into the first substantive presentation. Andrea?
Thank you very much, Mr. Duverne. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first panelist for this morning, and he is the Superintendent Sylvan McIntyre. He is the substantive member of the Royal Grenada Police Force for over 30 years. He has headed many departments within the Royal Grenada Police Force, and he is currently the disaster coordinator for the National Disaster Management Agency in Grenada. He headed the department between 2002 to 2008, and he has been heading it up from 2018 until present. He would have been the disaster coordinator at the time that we would have had the impact of Hurricane Ivan in Grenada. He also has been a member of the Regional Response Mechanism coordinated by CDEMA, responding to several events: Hurricane Dean 2007, Jamaica, Haiti 2010, Irma, BVI 2017, Bahamas with Dorian in 2019. He's the recipient of commendation of the CARICOM Certificate for Assistance to Haiti. He's a recipient of the Queen's Award, the Jubilee Medal for Service to Community, and he is a USAID BHA trainer in shelter management, initial damage assessment, and needs analysis. As such, therefore, I present him to you as he will lead us now in this first session of our discussions, which is entitled Policy and Protocols for Shelter Management. Over to you, Mr. McIntyre.
Thank you, Andrea Governor, Deputy Executive Director of CDEMA. I would like to recognize key delegates, the Executive Director, Acting Liz Riley of CDEMA. I would like to also recognize Denise Solis from the Federation of the Red Cross, my OECS colleagues across the Caribbean, fellow panelists, participants all. It gives me great pleasure to be part of this, what I call useful panel. It's a historic moment for all of us here in the Caribbean. It's a moment for us across the world having to face the kind of a pandemic situation we are facing. In light of that, we are threatened with an above average hurricane season. I would like to start my presentation by first establishing that we have not all lost it, and we are not starting from scratch. We actually have the foundation in terms of policies. We do have quite a number of instruments already established in the Caribbean. I'm grateful for the sterling leadership of CDEMA in this process that has really generated a few of the model policies and instruments that we are using. So as my short presentation is based on policy guidelines with special focus on protocol and procedure to integrate COVID-19, I would just like to establish that we are setting the standard. And the standard is that a policy is already in existence. If you give me a chance, a little break, please. My computer here is just not moving the slides. Okay, there we go. So we are setting the standard. And the first stage in actually setting the standard is to ensure that a policy is in existence. And we are assured that there is one in existence. Now, this policy is not deficient to a large extent, as it is detailed as to how governments and entities can adopt to the environmental shelter management. So the policy in itself, I have pulled a few excerpts from it. It's the model policy from CDEMA. It speaks of the government's responsibility to all people to organize resources, etc. It also establishes that government will make the necessary provisions to ensure that annual budgets and financial resources are provided for the execution of a shelter program. It speaks of government encouraging cooperations and consultation between the appropriate agencies to include non-governmental organization and voluntary-based organizations. The implementation of the policy in some cases has been a challenge throughout the region. And we would appreciate that the CARICOM region, or the Caribbean in itself, has quite a diverse level of persons, maybe possibly low income, and persons who live in vulnerable areas. And so it establishes the need, or it identified the need to ensure that a policy is written that drives this process. As a consequence, these persons who might be affected would need some place of temporary shelter because of natural disaster, maybe because of migration issues, etc. Now, some elements of the program that the policy speaks to. It speaks of the National Emergency Shelter Management Program, and that is critical to be established. It speaks of the provision of emergency accommodation with the services for persons who are displaced, and not just necessarily displaced at a particular time, but they're faced with a threat of being displaced. It speaks of the identification, retrofitting, and maintenance of suitable buildings that are used or to be used as shelters. It also speaks of the establishing of a mechanism for identification, maintenance, and the upkeep of shelters. Now, these pointers I am going through here are policy elements. Later on in my presentation, there are some questions that will be asked across, so that persons who are participants in this forum, you would want to be asking those questions, or we can start answering them together. There's some key focus areas that the policies across the Caribbean as developed should look at. National Shelter Management Body. How is that body built? The composition of it. What is the responsibility of such a body for the whole shelter program? The retrofitting, the maintenance, the repairs, the evaluation of these shelters. Are these programs really existing? Is there a mandatory training program that speaks to how people are channeled into being able to build houses, or how they are channeled into treating shelters if they have to use them? Support for rehabilitation. How does the country or the mechanism provide some support for people to come back to a near state of normalcy? Siting and construction of shelter, that has been an issue as to whether or not they are appropriately sited, or whether these things are built to a particular standard. Public education programs and information is something that we need to to really be cognizant of. I have chosen a few areas for consideration and adjustment / changes within a public health environment. And in this instance, we'll speak specifically to COVID. One, health and safety issues, construction, designation or the selection of shelters, the inspection process, and management and maintenance. One of the areas that comes straight into focus is the health and safety issue, the selection of teams. We are faced with a situation that is global, and it can have far-reaching, devastating consequences for persons if we are struck with a hurricane, God forbid. How do we select persons who would form part of these teams? What is the screening process, not just for persons coming into shelters, but for persons who themselves would be dealing with shelterees? How are we adjusting
It seems that we may have lost Mr. McIntyre. So I am going to just let us have a moment to see if the OECS team can get him back so that we can continue. Just give us a few minutes, please. This is the reality of the technical difficulties. Thank you. Okay, participants, apologies for that. Mr. McIntyre is having some technical difficulties. I think he lost connection on his side. So I think he would have been about halfway through his presentation. So we'll try to pick it back up from there. He would have talked about the model policy that exists and the provisions that it makes as it relates to the responsibilities of government to provide emergency shelter and he identified a number of areas of focus. And then he went on to identifying 6 areas that should be adjusted in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak. I think we probably will pick up the conversation from there, but it may be perhaps best for us to move on to the second presenter at this time, which would allow us an opportunity to get Mr. McIntyre back on and allow us then to proceed in a timely manner, because I am sure that some of the presenters may also, some of the participants may also have some other matters that they may have to address subsequent to this meeting. So if that is agreeable, with the OECS Commission, I think that we could potentially introduce the next speaker, if that's amenable to you. Yes, okay, so I will then hand over to the OECS Commission. Go ahead.
Thanks, Andrea. Well, yes, hopefully we'll get Mr. McIntyre.
Grenada's back.
So Mr. McIntyre is back, so okay, I will recuse myself and allow him to continue. So, Sylvan, please get yourself back on.
Please proceed, Mr. McIntyre. Thank you so much.
And thank you again. My apologies to all of our listeners for the slight disruption. So I was speaking on some of the key issues for consideration. And before I expand further, my going through the policy in terms of where we can focus, there is definitely the absence of focus on the health and safety issues. It's definitely one of the areas for consideration, for tweaking, for adjusting as we go forward. So the policy issues, redesigned, tweaked, must have strong focus on the health and safety issue. And I was speaking of garbage and waste disposal system. That is something that has to be integrated into the new norm going forward. Medical emergencies, how our medical emergencies are going to be treated in this environment. Are our shelters equipped? Are the isolation units established, identified, and fortified with items and equipment that will aid in emergency response? Isolation areas is one of the things that must be identified. They can either be identified as part of the structure, or they can be identified within the closest proximity. In the event that there is an outbreak, there is some symptoms of any outbreak at all, that persons can be treated or isolated in those areas. Sanitization stations and equipment. The new norm, as it is established for businesses and other sectors across countries and territories, must be the focus going forward as to how we establish shelter systems in terms of sanitization stations and the equipment that are part of the system or should be integrated. A neglected aspect of the whole process in health and welfare is the whole aspect of the psychosocial support. How do we cater for those who are already traumatized by having to face a pandemic as severe as COVID-19? With the threat of a tropical cyclone or hurricane, people would have flashback into the times when they have been impacted by Hurricane Ivan in our case, Hurricane Janet in our case, and for the other hurricanes impacted other persons within the region. That would be an issue. So the psychosocial support in terms of integrating that health and wellness must be a focus area within policies. Looking at construction and so forth, how do we build these facilities? Are we building facilities that are purpose-built? Are we now going to say that our trust going forward, we are going to integrate or incorporate isolation units and health and safety units within the system? Where do we build these facilities? Are we going to be citing them based on what our policy says, our building code design? Designation of shelters. How are these facilities designated? Are they really categorized according to hazards and levels of vulnerabilities? The other question that we would want to ask ourselves, and policy directives should drive to, are current shelter facilities sufficient? Now, how can we guarantee sufficient facilities? You may ask, there's a population of 105,000 persons, and therefore we should have buildings and facilities that should be able to accommodate 105 persons. That might not quite be the case. The point is, the point here is, how would our recommendation, our suggestions be supported by science or by data? We must move to the point where demographics in terms of vulnerability, in terms of persons needing shelters, that must be driven by some scientific research. So in other words, if a population of 105,000 is affected, what percentage of this population, what percentage of the parish or municipality that will require certain aspect and amount of shelter? So going forward, our process must be designed scientifically to inform the process of quantities and the sufficiency of shelters. And another challenge with the few slides, it's just 2 more slides coming, and there is a slide freeze again. Okay, the inspection process is the final aspect of what I'm going to speak to, and then the public education. The inspection process, should we do it annually? Should it be done monthly, or should it be done continuous? The other question here is the inspection process hurricane-centric? Are we channeling our communities or vulnerable persons into a mode of conducting shelter inspection before the hurricane season? Are we considering those to be, or have we justified that they are emergency shelters and not hurricane shelters? The mere fact that our system caters for a process of inspection to be concluded on or before the hurricane season is channeling us to believe that these are hurricane shelters. It is something that needs to be addressed. Now, what are the guiding principles of the inspecting team? What are they driven by? What does policy guidelines speak to? The team or the composition, are we building these teams that the composition addresses the issues that need to be addressed as we look at shelters? The management and maintenance of facility, is there a management and maintenance system that is documented and implemented? Do we actually go, most of our facilities inspected, they have major deficiencies because the process of maintenance is not there. Is there a monitoring and evaluating process? Are management teams identified according to policy, or are they just selected ad hocly? Do we just pull some people together and say, I want you to become the management team? But is our policy driving us in that direction? And finally, public education and awareness program. Our public education and awareness program has to be tweaked, has to be channeled in such a way that our populace has to have the conviction that their home is the best shelter. And unless our policy is driving us into this direction, we will have this ultra dependence on the purpose-built facilities or facilities created by the national systems, and persons will be dependent on that system and not focusing on building structures and homes that can withstand different types of hazards. I rest my presentation and will avail for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McIntyre. I will encourage you to post your questions in the question and answer section. I think we can have another 5 to potentially 10 minutes. So please place your questions in the Q&A, and I will give a brief summary. I had started before, but just to remind you, Mr. McIntyre in his presentation, thank you so much for that. He did indicate that we do have a policy already existing. There is a model policy that has been established by CDEMA, obviously in consultation with our various partners, and therefore we have a standard by which we can go. It provides for the government managing the resources available to it, making certain provisions and identifying specific buildings which are safe for occupation. It is also against the background that we have moderate to low income families that live in vulnerable areas, and those who can be affected will need shelter. There's provision for emergency shelter, emergency accommodation, as well as maintenance of buildings, etc., to be used. He identified a number of areas of focus, but specifically highlighted 6 areas in need of attention in the context of the COVID-19. Those areas were health and safety, looking at the matters of the construction, designation or selection, inspection, the management and maintenance, and addressing the area of public awareness and education. And in those, the context specifically of the health and safety, he talked about this area being a major area that needed some attention, especially noting the COVID-19, and that the public awareness and education should also highlight that home is the best shelter. So with that, I see that there are a couple of comments that are in the chat, but there are also some specific questions that I would like to pose. So there are 2 things. One says, your home is the best shelter. We must educate our people to accept this. And I do see a little bit of a note of it in the chat that says to change the perception, that we might also want to hold the inspection a little bit earlier, and also probably to present the list maybe at the start of the year. But maybe you might want to give a little bit of a reflection also on home as best shelter. And then there's another question here about what arrangements are there for accommodation of homeless persons in shelters during sudden emergencies or disasters. So, and then there's a third. So we can probably treat with those, get a little bit of an answer. So there's one on homeless persons in shelters, exploring a little bit on home as the best shelter. And then there is one on the accessibility, for example, for people with disabilities, what needs to be considered with planning to reconstruct and rehabilitate shelters. And I do know that there is some work that has been ongoing in Grenada in that regard. So Mr. McIntyre, I will ask you to respond to those questions. There is a question as well that seemed to have been answered, but it may have been directed at CDEMA. So I will also give a little bit of an answer on those. But those 3 we can dispense with at this time, and then we might have another 5 minutes to answer another 3. So Mr. McIntyre, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you again, Ms. Grosvenor. As it relates to persons who might be homeless, it is a process or a challenge that one would have, but the state mechanism has to adjust itself to accommodate such persons. They are not necessarily left out in the cold, but they would be brought in, and they would be brought to the attention of the social services department and welfare, who normally would look after these persons or have some level of care giving program for them. As it speaks to home, I am one of those advocates for your home is your best shelter. As I alluded to in the presentation, our public education across territories and countries must focus or must drive people into building homes properly. And we also teach in shelter management that if the entire structure, your financial capacity doesn't afford you to build a house in a particular way, then at least some aspect of it should be your safe room, so that there will be less dependence on the shelter structure. The question about persons who are physically challenged, the age, etc., it has been one of the more recent focus, particularly in Grenada within the last 2 years. Thanks again, we had a program here through the Caribbean Canada Risk Disaster Management Fund, assisted us in Grenada in enhancing or retrofitting facilities with rails and ramps and bathroom and toilet amenities and so for persons living with difficulties by age or physical challenges, etc. So there are programs designed for that. Are they adequate? The answer is definitely no. We would love to see more of countries and systems focusing on structures, not just shelters, but facilities and buildings that the challenged need to have access to. I hope I would have given justice to answering some of these questions.
Thank you very much. There are still a few, there are a few that have come up, but just on the one or two, if I can just explore this a little bit with you. So on the matter of the physically challenged and the inadequacy that you would have mentioned as it relates to sheltering, because COVID-19 obviously would create a real challenge, and dealing with the physically challenged would also be in the public shelters would create a challenge as well. Do you think that there could be a sort of a partnership with governments in terms of strengthening the capacities of families who have persons who are physically challenged within their households, and being able to make arrangements to care for them at home if they could? Do you think that this is something that governments can potentially explore?
Thank you. This is a question that is well placed, and it reiterates the need for integration and involvement of other sectors. The first responsibility to anyone who is aged or has some physical challenge would be the responsibility of the relatives or immediate family. And there is need for that collaboration of, and it would be what we can call an all hands on deck process, meaning that the family, the community, and the government should collaborate to ensure that these persons are taken care of. But I really want us not to try to lay the blame and the responsibility solely on the governments and the state mechanism. Families, individuals, societies, and communities must take responsibility. The disadvantage or the inconvenience of having to move persons from one place to the other, that's one activity that we can avoid by encouraging community involvement and partnership with NGOs at the local levels.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Okay, so I think we'll just in the next 2 minutes or so to manage the time, just there is the whole matter you had talked, one of the issues that you addressed was the whole matter of some of the inspection and the designation. And I think there is a question here in the chat that talks about that there are non-state actors who are who have buildings not owned by the state that are shelters. How do we encourage them to construct their buildings with these considerations in mind? That's one. And then there's the whole matter of the migrants, looking at how do we look at the migration issues, like we have Venezuelans throughout the region, and there's also Dominicans that are in the region as well. And how do we also provide information in shelters that are bilingual and having interpretation services also for some of these persons. And it may not just be Venezuelans, it may be other persons who speak French, Dutch, etc. So if you can just treat with those two matters, and then I think we'll probably have to wrap up on the questions and probably provide some other answers through the facilitators to the questions that have been raised.
Great. And as I mentioned before, the partnership issue is one that we welcome on board. And as recently as I think a year or two ago, we had the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. They have been one of the entities within the Caribbean, along with the USAID, BHA, who have been assisting in shelter processes. And they have been advocating and helping us to channel our thinking in that direction, that we must also think outside the box, that we are likely to have the migration issues and people who are multilingual and bilingual, etc., that we would have to ensure that our system, our shelter system, caters for persons who may be of a different nationality, speak a different language. They too should be integrated into that kind of a process so that we can cater for them. And sure, with migration also comes the challenge of security. It also comes with the challenge of the health issue. So how do we enhance our security apparatus and our health apparatus in terms of screening and ensuring that our borders are protected and that the shelter process, it is channeled through the system and the appropriate direction that we want it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mr. McIntyre. I think there was one question that talked about the whole matter of evacuation, and I just wanted to put a little, and there was a question asked of CDEMA, and I just wanted to put a little bit of things in context here. So to indicate that in the 2017, for example, if I can use that as an example, there were high rates of displacement per population size in these small island developing states. Hurricanes Irma and Maria did result in many Caribbean countries and territories experiencing internal displacement and receiving displaced persons from nearby countries which needed sheltering. And, you know, for instance, one island was totally evacuated. So what we found, though, is that few countries had incorporated displacement concerns into international policy documents, and therefore the shelter management arrangements would not have been adequate to accommodate many persons. So you know that long-term human mobility derived from disasters and climate change remains challenging, and it does need to be treated. And I just wanted to say that CDEMA does have a model evacuation policy and model evacuation plan, and these are also instruments that can be utilized on the matters of evacuation, and obviously now looking at that interface with sheltering when these matters also come into place. So I just wanted to put that on the table. I will wrap up here and to say thank you very much, Mr. McIntyre, for your presentation. It was certainly quite enlightening. There are some key points that you would have mentioned, and I would have gone through them before, but certainly you've underscored those 6 areas that need adjustments in this COVID-19. You've addressed the matter of health, and also you've raised this matter also of security when we have to deal with migrant persons and so on. And we have to therefore strengthen areas of health and security, the matter of the construction, the designation, the inspection, management and maintenance, and public education and awareness. And remember that the homes should be considered their first place of safe shelter. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And we will now hand over to Mr. Crispin Duverne, who will introduce our second presenter. Thank you very much, Mr. McIntyre.
Thank you, Ms. Grosvenor. Thank you as well.
Thank you, Mr. McIntyre, and thank you, Andrea, my co-moderator. So now we'll go on to our second presentation, which is the legal and regulatory requirements for shelter management. And this presentation will focus on the enabling environment for shelter management, highlighting some of the fundamental requirements for consideration at the community level, as well as the identification of gaps. Before I introduce our presenter, just a reminder to the other panelists that there are still questions, unanswered questions in the Q&A, so if you have the opportunity to address these, that'll be useful. And at this time, though, I'd like to present our next presenter, who is Ms. Audrey Mullins, Disaster Risk Management Specialist in the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs at USAID. But she's also a former deputy director of CDEMA. She has been described by some of the people who know her as a foreparent of disaster risk management in the Caribbean, and also an early advocate of shelter management in the region. So with great pleasure, I call on Ms. Audrey Mullins to lead us into our next presentation. So Ms. Mullins, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Ms. Mullins? Ms. Mullins is coming on now, yes. And please remember to unmute your mic.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Hello? Hello? Okay,
Hello,
good morning, everyone.
Good.
I want to recognize okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And I am getting a signal that says my connection is unstable, so I hope you can bear with me. But I want to recognize my fellow panelists and moderators, and to also thank OECS and CDEMA for inviting me to participate in this particular webinar on shelter management best practices and tools for preparedness as the disaster risk management specialist from USAID Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. And my contribution to the conversation today will be on the legal, as you heard before, and regulatory requirements for shelter management. And what I want to do is to just take a brief look at where we were so that everybody can see how far we have come in 2020. And so I want to look at also some possible future considerations. And my presentation will look very briefly at the genesis then, where we were. A brief look at the emergency shelter, what is our regulatory and legal framework, why it is essential, what should it include, and then I want to briefly recommend all shelter managers and coordinators who have not yet seen the emergency shelter management manual for the Commonwealth of Dominica, that you look at it and I'll tell you why, some actions for the future, and then some brief considerations for COVID if time permits. So without further ado, let us look at how we got here. And I'm casting us back to 1979 and 80. And if you look at the slide, you'll see that 20,000 persons were evacuated in St. Vincent. 40,000 were displaced by June floods in Jamaica. Hurricane David hit Dominica and there were 75% or about 56,000 persons homeless. And then St. Lucia got affected by Hurricane Allen in 1980 and almost 10,000 people were displaced. Now, if you look at the trends then, schools, church halls, community centers were used as shelters because they were available, most of them. We're still doing that today. There was no organized program, so it was really ad hoc. People were evacuated, they need somewhere to stay. And so they were put in these buildings. No, but very few people, if any, had any training at all. And in some instances, as in the case of St. Vincent, there were some long and lengthy stays in these buildings because, as I said before, there was no real organized program. Now, I want to briefly talk about the emergency shelter, and my focus is really on a place that provides temporary accommodation. And the idea of the temporary accommodation is to provide life-saving support following any type of crisis, whether it's a hurricane or a volcanic emergency. And we know that we want to encourage people to shelter in place. And if we build our accommodation, our homes, to have even one safe room. But we also know that this is not going to happen in the short term, and therefore we need to have the emergency shelter. So what's the regulatory framework, the legal and regulatory framework? And this is something that many people have not really wrapped their heads around. The fact that any legal and regulatory framework must include a number of things. It's going to have all the laws, any regulations that have been written, policies, and all the processes. But these have to be officially designated and approved by government. And the idea, the purpose behind that is so that we regulate the management of emergency shelters. And I don't think that, although we have written, as you heard with Mr. McIntyre earlier, that we have policies, I am not sure that every country in the CDEMA participating states have actually approved them. They have been written, they have been designated, and that's one of the things that we have to look at for the future. Have we approved them? Because we may be operating ultra vires. All right, so what are the essential things in the legal and regulatory framework? And the idea is that we want to provide an effective framework to facilitate emergency shelter management integration into our disaster response programming. But we have to take that within the context of the resources that we have at the national and local level. And we want to do this to ensure that the care, the protection, the security of persons who are displaced, that we have that kind of care and protection. We also need to ensure that the roles and responsibilities are defined and they are also understood by all those, a clear understanding of that. Also, accountability is important, and the code of conduct for all persons who are actually involved, all the actors, all the stakeholders. And then identifying what those resources are to support emergency shelter management. And also rights, that the rights of the shelter managers, the coordinators, and of course, persons who go to shelter are protected. Because remember, we have the Constitution, bills of rights, and that those sort of legal elements that need to be looked at. Then we also want to ensure that the mandate of institutions that are involved, that they are directed effectively and efficiently. Now, there is a reluctance sometimes when people are affected. So we would hope that if we have a really efficient and coordinated program, that it would increase the level of confidence of people who do not have any alternative, that they would want to be part of that emergency shelter, because we have a structure, we have a policy, and we have all of these in place. We also have to have the framework, legal and regulatory, to ensure that we plan, the planning is taking place, how we use the shelters, how they are operated, in general, the management of the actual shelter, where we take people who are vulnerable and have no alternative. And then there are international standards that must obtain. So we have to make sure that those are included in any policies and procedures that we have. So we want to ensure those minimum standards. It's essential again, because we want to ensure the accountability, the understanding of the roles, the regulation of the management and use, and all of those I just mentioned are actually essential in order to ensure that we have a coordinated, efficient program. Now let's take a look at some significant contribution to the development of the legal and regulatory framework for emergency shelter management. And one of the earliest training activities that I'm aware of actually took place in Barbados, when the Central Emergency had a training course. But it was not until 1994 when USAID, OFDA, which is now the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs, pulled together a cadre of persons within the region and developed a training course and a reference guide, which is still being used at this present time, of course updated. And then the British Virgin Islands prepared a manual which looked at the daily operations within the shelters, and the Dominica Emergency Shelter Management Manual. I'll come back to that. But I also want to add to that significant contribution the preparation of the Emergency Shelter Manual by the CDEMA. And this was done after Hurricane George, and there was a need for identifying and managing shelters more efficiently, more coordinated. And so the OECS provided support to CDEMA for the preparation of an emergency shelter manual, which I understand was recently updated. But more recently is the Model Comprehensive Disaster Management Legislation of 2013. So all of these have made some significant contribution to the development of the legal and regulatory framework. And so all the laws and all the requirements are in these documents. And I'm going to take Dominica separately. So later on, I will come back to that. But let us look at what the framework includes, and it must have a policy. It ought to have a management structure. It must have an oversight body, which would be the coordinating body with authority and functions that ensures that it can implement that program. Then we need to have some activation and authorization protocols for the program, identification of what the roles, responsibilities, and skill set of shelter managers and the support team, and the core functions within the emergency shelter. We also need to include in that the coordination responsibilities, and a number of government ministries, agencies, NGOs, and other actors are involved. So we need to have those responsibilities clearly defined, organized. We also need to have within the legal and regulatory framework, planning, operations, and I heard questions about inspection earlier, shelter location, the buildings to be used, all of those have to be included so that we have a clear definition of what buildings we need, what the structure is, where they are located, and so on. One of the areas that is critical is the information management and sharing system. Do all the stakeholders, all the operators, all the actors, is there a chain of information management and information sharing so that everybody within the context of the emergency shelter management program knows exactly what information should be passed, who does it, when, and what is that system? And then I heard the question earlier about displacement of persons, persons who are homeless. So we want to put in that emergency shelter management legal and regulatory framework the considerations for cross-cutting issues. So we're looking at children, we're looking at the elderly, we're looking at families, we're looking at psychosocial support. So all those cross-cutting issues should be embedded in a legal and regulatory framework. In addition, the disaster management legislation, which includes shelter management, should cover a number of areas: planning and strategy development. I mentioned program oversight earlier, shelter operations, coordinations, how you manage the program in terms of monitoring and evaluation. Those are some of the key elements that I would recommend and suggest to be included in that legal and regulatory framework. And I just want to reflect a bit on the CDEMA Comprehensive Disaster Management Legislation, Part 4, which speaks to the National Disaster Management Agency. Section 29(1) to 9 speaks to the responsibilities of the national directors regarding shelters. Now, those countries that have actually used that model legislation would have included section 29(1) to 9. And what it does is it includes the establishment and listing of shelter. There are a number of others, but I have selected out 4 of those. The establishment and listing of shelters, suitability for the different hazards, liability when a shelter is occupied, so periods of occupation, and government shelters and shelters that are, I have called them private shelters because they're not owned by government, but they may be public buildings like churches or church halls and so on. So the National Disaster Management Agency, once that legislation is, as in the case of, say, Jamaica, which used this CDEMA model legislation to, and this was passed in 2014, I think it was 2014 or 2015. These are the responsibilities of the national directors, and therefore by law, they have that responsibility to ensure that these things happen. In addition to section 29, there is also section 30, 1 to 5, which speaks to shelter regulations. And within the context of that shelter regulation, there is a responsibility of the minister with responsibility for disaster management. And note that it says an inter-ministerial committee. They make provisions for regulations. So in addition to those that comes in the model legislation from CDM legislation from CDEMA, the minister can, based on what's happening within his country, he can or she can ensure that you have shelter regulations, elaborate, enhance those that CDEMA has provided. So even though you have that, and in a brief cursory look at those regulations, I think there may be areas, I didn't have enough time to go in detail, but there may be areas that the CDEMA participating state will have to look at to enhance those regulations. So we have the regulations, and we also have the responsibility of the disaster management director and the minister having a responsibility to ensure that those regulations exist. Now, let's look at Dominica's manual. And the manual I am referring to is the first edition, which was facilitated by the IOM and funded by USAID OFDA. And I would recommend that every country look at this manual because it's very comprehensive in nature. It covers your program managers, it covers your shelter managers, it covers your other stakeholders. And it has reference for different aspects of shelter management. So there's planning and strategy development, and there's a table that outlines in the planning and strategy development which ministries have what responsibility. Like for instance, in Dominica, the Attorney General has responsibility for ensuring that the law and regulations for shelter management within the context of disaster legislation, that those exist. So they have named all persons who have responsibilities, all stakeholders within that. Then there is a section on oversight and monitoring, and it clearly defines who does what. The coordination of operations, again, that is clearly defined, and there's a section for closing and evaluation. But the manual is so comprehensive, it covers who is a displaced person, what a shelter is. All the responsibilities that I have mentioned in the legal and regulatory framework are actually clearly defined and outlined in that manual, which I am recommending for those persons and program managers to take a good look at. And my references will give you the location of that particular manual. So let's look at some things that we need to be looking at for the future. And these are tied up with some of the gaps that currently exist. An annual meeting to look at the program. It may not be necessary every year, but I'm recommending that it be done every year because you want to look at what the current trends are and to look at your legislation to see if there is anything missing based on those new and current trends. To adjust the plans and the processes to ensure that those lessons learned are included. And I think that's what Dominica did with coming up with this really comprehensive manual. The other area that has been bandied about in this region for some time is the construction of safe shelters. It's like India and Pakistan and so on, where there has been over time the construction of safe shelters. And this is something that we might want to consider at some stage. And I mentioned the effective communication system. So that's something that we have to look at. What's our communication system and how effective it is for the shelter program. We also need to look at the services provided in shelters. I know we don't want to make people too comfortable, but we also need to look at the dignity of the persons who are in shelters. And therefore, we need to look at what services are offered and how we do them. And if they need upgrading, then we need to address that. Now, there is a big discussion in Jamaica, and that's one of the reasons why I'm mentioning it here. Remuneration for shelter managers. And perhaps one possibility exists with putting it in maybe the public workers or whomever it is seen fit to include it in, so that it becomes part of a job description, so that we can ensure that when we say that there are people who need to be protected and we will put them in shelters, that we have shelter managers. Because if we don't have that kind of management, then it could end up creating challenges for us. And the final future thing I would want us to look at, the final future area, is the enactment of disaster legislation, because I know that there are countries that have not enacted the disaster legislation, which provides the platform for shelter management. And therefore, we need to ensure that that happens, because if you are running shelters and there is no legal or regulatory framework to support that, then it means that you could be challenged by people who are in the shelters, by people who have gone to the shelters, because we do not have the kind of legislation to support what we are doing. And therefore, it is important, as we increasingly move into the 21st century, that we need to look at this, because people are challenging systems. And so we want to ensure that those persons who are managing the programs are protected. And just some thoughts on COVID-19. And because we are operating in the context of a pandemic, I am recommending that the risk is studied yet, especially in the area of shelter management, that we look at how we can make those adjustments, bearing in mind that a pandemic is there's a potential for a pandemic, whether it's 100 years time based on the conversations that have been going that every 100 years, but at least we would have put something in place to ensure that if it happens again, that we are prepared. So we're looking at all the rules, the processes, the restrictions of COVID, and what kind of protocols can we put in place to ensure that we are covered. Some thoughts on shelter occupation. How will the shelters be occupied within the context of COVID-19? How many persons will we put in shelters? Because if we look at social distancing, or as I like to term it, physical distancing, there will be the need for additional shelters. It's not business as usual. We cannot put all the people in the shelters that we had before. So we need to consider physical distancing. We also consider the training in the particular protocols that we design. Also, the provision of PPEs for shelter managers and support team. But should shelterees arrive at a shelter, what is the policy for those people who may not have? And of course, if we're operating the shelters within the COVID pandemic, Mr. McIntyre mentioned a number of them, but I just wanted to hand washing stations, the demarcation of isolation areas should anybody be affected by COVID-19. So those are some of the things that we really have to take into consideration. And in addition to that, we also have to look at designing procedures for monitoring shelterees for symptoms of COVID-19, but not only COVID-19, but other illnesses. We need to look at how we monitor mental health and the behavior concerns and how we provide daily updates to the local health department. So these are some things that we need to look at the policy. And finally, I think this is my final 2 slides, the challenges that may occur during this pandemic. And there may be a heightened level of anxiety in the shelter, so that's something we need to take into consideration. And that trained personnel may not be available or they may be unwilling to assist. And so we have to look at what is the protocol that we're going to put in place for that. And just to reiterate that there may not be enough masks or face coverings, and there's lack of compliance with the physical distancing and other preventive measures. So what is the policy? What's the procedure we are going to shelter management in the emergency situation? And I thank you for listening. I hope everything came through because I kept getting a signal that says my internet connection may be unstable. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mullins. Thank you very much for that presentation. Yes, here and there we got a little discussion, but for the most part, your presentation came through very well, and it was a very rich presentation actually. And I know we're running a little over time, so I'm going to just I'm going to read through, be very brief with regard to the summary. Thank you for running us through the history, some of the background and mentioning some of the events that happened like in St. Vincent and Lucia. Of course, Hurricane Allen resonated with me because that was the first real hurricane that I experienced as a youngster. And you also mentioned some of the prerequisites that, some of the things that were the essentials that should be in the legal and regulatory framework. For example, clear policy, structures, authority, etc. The activation mechanism and so on. And Dominique was highlighted as a kind of a model framework. And then we looked at the future, some of the future needs in terms of construction of safe shelters and so on. Also the questions of things like remuneration for shelter managers. And we also presented on some of the challenges facing us in the current pandemic. For example, the whole issue of physical distancing, the unwillingness of professionals to get involved because of the risk to themselves, etc. So at this point, we have a couple of questions, just about 3, and in the interest of time, we'll just entertain these. There's one: to what extent does a legal regulatory framework align itself with not simply the short-term shelter management response needs, but also the medium long-term development strategies of national governments? And there's another one: many islands of the region deal a lot with the sea. Any consideration of including protocols for management of marine shelters in the discussion? And then there's another one: job description of government personnel certainly needs to be addressed. In Barbados, Ministry of Education has primary responsibility for shelter management, yet teachers easily make themselves unavailable for staff shelters when they are open. The general feeling is shelter management is not their job description. So these, if there's any key one you want to enter, we can't answer all, but if you at least want to answer just one, and then the others you can answer the others online as we hand over. So just one question of those 3 parts will be answered, and the rest you can tackle online in the Q&A.
All right, I want to look at the mandatory training program and the topics to be covered. Well, it's the shelter managers, but also the support team that would need the training. And I know that we have trained quite a bit of people in the region, but when we need shelter managers and support team, we can hardly find some of them. But the training program provides an overview of disaster risk management, because it's taken for granted that people who come may not have been exposed to disaster risk management. So that's a given. In addition to that, so it would take them through a very brief look at disaster risk management, but also the operations of a shelter, I'm talking off the top of my head right now because there is, I don't have all of the training program before me, but I can say that the operation of the shelter is a must. Issues and challenges that occur in the shelter is a must. The provisioning in the shelter, the services, the health, psychosocial support. But for those of you who have not experienced a shelter managers training program, you can actually collaborate or liaise with your national disaster coordinator, because they do have the training program and the outlines for the USAID which has been adopted in the region for training of personnel.
Thanks.
Other.
I have to stop here. You perhaps may want to answer the other questions online in the Q&A, but I will now hand over I'll have to hand over in the interest of time to Andrea to introduce the next presenter, if you don't mind. Thanks.
No problem.
Thank you very much. Certainly quite a bit of information has been shared, and certainly titillating our appetites and many, many questions. I think we have another exciting presentation coming up for you, and this is going to be by Denise Solis. She's the Regional Emergency Shelter Senior Officer of IFRC Americas. She's an architect by profession with a master's degree in international project management, and has been working with IFRC in operations such as in the Ecuador earthquake, Hurricane Irma in Cuba, and Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. She has developed and coordinated projects in international organizations since 2016, and also with different NGOs. And she's more recently supporting the ongoing operations with shelter activities in the Americas. I therefore would present Ms. Solis, who will present on the topic tools and technical requirements in support of shelter management. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for your time and for providing us the floor to be with you this morning. I just want to check that you're able to see my presentation. Andrea, could you please confirm that to me?
Yes, I can confirm. Can you put it on presentation mode, please?
Yes, I will.
Great, fantastic. Go ahead.
So this morning, what I'm going to share with you basically are the tools and technical requirements in support of the shelter management, but more than that are the regional good practices for sheltering at the community level. We have been facing a new reality that we were not ready to face due to COVID-19. And basically what I'm going to share with you is the different responses that we have been providing alongside the region, where we have opened different type of collective centers or shelters, also known, because due to COVID-19. And so basically what I'm going to share are the strategies implemented and some recommendations that we have been seeing that we need to enhance and reinforce because of the ongoing operations that we have in the Americas. So as you can see in here, the emergency responses that we have opened, the reason why we opened the different type of shelters are because of the border closures left many families unable to return to their homes, and they were reallocated to isolation or transit centers. Also, the lack of house of property, homelessness. Many homeless people, they were reallocated into collective centers in order to avoid that the virus was going to be spread. And last but not least, which is one of the main topics that we're going to be discussing during this presentation, are the different type of disasters, hurricane disasters. The hurricane season already started, and some tropical storms already passed through the region. Specifically talking in Cuba, for example, where we already have some rains, and also in El Salvador, where many families have many destroyed homes, and there are these different type of government and partners needed to move and reallocate the people to the collective or transit centers. So what we need to think in order to better respond to the different type of emergencies is how we're going to adapt our emergency, because we have right now COVID-19. So there's different type of measures that we need to take into consideration in order to have more security to the staff that we're going to be working with, and not only them, but the people that are going to be receiving the different type of transit centers. I'm not going to mention specifically the different type of policies, because that's something that Ms. Audrey and the different speakers are going to be discussing. But I would like to share with you what has been working for us that could be applied and could also work and be useful for the different type of responses whenever a hurricane or another type of disaster strikes. So the strategies that we have been taking into consideration are the main one. The first one is prioritize the health and safety of staff, volunteers, and people taking care of the collective center or of the shelter. Why? As you know, in the movement, the different national societies, they work mainly with many volunteers. And even though they have their staff trained, it is really difficult. It is going to be really difficult for them, and even for other type of entities, to assist shelters if they don't have any protection with them. They are not going to be feeling safe to assist people. Maybe like if there's a lot of there's a big load of families in these shelters, and they don't have the adequate protection, they're not going to be feeling safe. So we need to make the staff and the people that is going to be taking care of the different type of shelters safe first. The second point is optimize the spaces to reduce the different type of risks. And now when we are in this new reality where social distancing is a rule, it's a key, and we need to keep it. And we know that that's going to be really difficult and really challenging whenever it comes to reallocate many families into a shelter, because they all need a place to be reallocated. So one of the main things that the governments have been working, and I know also that the OECS alongside with CDEMA, they have identified the current existing and safe and secure shelters where people can be reallocated. But now what we need to take into consideration is the size of the shelter, because we're not going to be able to fit the same amount of people before than right now. So we need to learn how we can optimize the spaces in order to reduce risk. The third point is increase the communication to cover key messages. The communication should go to the bottom to the top of all of the levels. With this, basically talking about the type of coordination. The roles and responsibilities should be really clear. That's what something that Ms. Audrey was mentioning before. If you have a clear idea of who's going to be in charge of the shelter, who's going to be assisting the different type of spaces that are going to be created inside of the shelter, the people they will know to who they can talk about their different problems, because as in the first presentation they were mentioning about the mental health right now, even though we are not, we have maybe in the Caribbean, we don't have any open shelters because of maybe a hurricane disaster, but maybe we do have it because of COVID-19. We need to learn how to appropriate share the key messages in order so that the people can know where they can approach and feel safe. And the last one is to provide adequate guidance to staff to increase awareness and build capacity. with this is one of the main topics that Ms. Audrey was mentioning before. The trainings are key. If we don't have trained staff in place, it's going to be really difficult to assist to any type of disaster. And even in this case, that we're discussing about the management of collective centers, I would like to highlight that we have been having different type of, let's say, webinars and online trainings that we have provided to more than 20 different countries in order to respond to this emergency of COVID-19. But we need to, what we are learning in the way, it's how we can adapt our response of opening a shelter with these new measures that we need to take into consideration to better manage the collective centers. So we have been doing this, sharing these webinars alongside with several type of tools and guidelines. And to do this, we have been working alongside with IOM, because they are the ones that are taking the lead more in the management of collective centers, talking about in the humanitarian structure. So we have all these guidelines and tools are inside of we have an online platform that it's called Soconi. I will share this main website with our hosts, so that whenever the webinar stops, they can share with you either our presentations, because I was reading that many of you wanted to know if these presentations are going to be shared or not. So we're gonna share our presentations with our hosts alongside with the different guidelines and tools that we have been using that also are gonna be useful for you for the different type of responses that you're gonna be having. So moving to the recommendations. In these points, I just highlighted like the main key points that we have that has been working properly for us, so that you can apply them accordingly. And many of these points, maybe you're gonna be listening in the different type of presentations, on the first presentation, on the second presentation, and I believe also in the last one. So I have collected the ones that have been working for us already in the different type of responses that we have been providing. And the first one is that the way that the shelter is planned and managed has a huge impact on the resilience of the affected persons, and also in their access to the assistance and protection. So what we recommend is to have different level of coordinations inside of the shelter, because it's not only managing a shelter, it's the type of resources that you have inside of the shelter. So do we have a mental or a health system to provide PSS to the families? Is our WASH system working accordingly? Do we have a safe place for our kids inside of the shelter? So there's many other things that we need to consider in order to plan a shelter. The second point is the location, size, and duration of the shelter, because whenever we open a shelter, we need to think that that shelter shouldn't last forever. All of the shelters, they have a day that they're going to be open and the day that they should be closed, because there's also a challenge that whenever we take families that they have lost their homes because they were destroyed, they would like to rely on the resources that the government is providing, because they don't have any other type of resource. They don't have a livelihood. So we need to help them how to create a business continuity plan for this matter. The third point is identify essential activities in the collective center or in the shelter. Existing resources and business continuity plans with minimal staff. So if before we used to manage a shelter, let's say with 50 staff members, now we need to reduce them, because also the amount of people that we're going to be receiving inside of the shelter is not the same. And the more people that we have inside of the same place, there's going to be a high risk of infection. Identify alternative spaces for isolation of positive COVID-19 cases. So there's another thing that has been really working a lot for us, and it's not only identifying alternative spaces, but inside of the shelter, how we are planning the distribution internally of the shelter, it's also key, so that we try to maintain the people and their different type of activities that they want to have in order with different timing, so that let's say if there's a lunchtime and we know that we cannot have 20 people and instead we need to have 10 at the same time, we need to manage how the different type of activities are going to be taking place in the shelter. The selection of and training of actors on management and referral mechanisms for potential cases of COVID-19. So in this picture, you can see this was in Bolivia, and the way that since the beginning, how it starts whenever you start to receive different type of families to the shelter, it's important to have what I was mentioning at the beginning, adequate protection material in order to, because we don't know whenever someone will come, if they will have the virus or not. So it's really important to provide personal protective equipment, screening areas, and some isolation areas, because in case that we find that there's some cases with families that have COVID-19, they should go to an isolation area, but they shouldn't remain over there. We need to have a referral mechanism in order like either to call an ambulance or see if there is a way to move them to the closest hospital or area where they can assist these families. The ventilation is something crucial right now because of the virus. So even though like we have, let's say a gymnasium, we need to have more ventilation than before. I mean, there's always the need to have a ventilation, but right now we really need to take care of how the area of or the place that we're going to be putting families inside, it's been set up. Avoid overcrowding. So whenever we talk about the sphere standards, which are the humanitarian standards of how to assist an emergency in terms of shelter, and whenever we're going to rebuild or provide a temporary accommodation, we say that there should be a 3.5 square meters per person. That, in this case, due to COVID-19, there's many rules and procedures that different type of organizations have been putting together after learned what they have been doing in the different emergencies. And what they have learned is mainly that, yeah, that's the basic, the 3.5. But the recommendation is even 11 square meters per family. That means that if you have the bed, you need to take into consideration 2 meters at front, 2 meters at each of the sides, and that's just for the area where the families are going to be sleeping, like each person's going to be sleeping. And the other recommendation is that in order to have an adequate management of the shelter, it's try to have less than 50 people inside of the shelter. The last 2 points is help to restore family links. Once families are displaced to the different type of transit centers, isolation centers, or shelters, they have lost most of them. They could feel that they have lost their dignity. So for them, it will be really useful if they can create a line or a communication center inside of the shelter so that they can start contacting their families, because the last resource for us and for them should be having families inside of a collective center. We should always try to prioritize the safe sheltering at home. So trying to find their families, for them, it's going to be really important. And the last point is the good communication and community engagement. That was one of the key strategies that I was discussing since the beginning, and it's how we can properly communicate with the different actors that are going to be inside of the shelter, and try to communicate with them and also engage them. So asking them, how are you feeling, and how we can create this space a better place for the families that are going to be staying there for more, let's say maybe more than a week, because we don't know how long they're going to be staying, or what are the plans of the different governments in order to assist these families. And whenever we talk about shelter, there is a phrase that we use in the shelter sector, that is there is no shelter without WASH. As you know, the WASH, it's we're talking about water, cleaning areas, how we can prioritize our interventions in order to manage the waste and safe control the different type of vectors. So this graphic that I have put in this slide was took from the sphere standards that the WASH sector created for the coronavirus response. So, and it is highlighting one of the main points that we have been discussing, like the previous panelists, and I believe that the last panelists are also going to be discussing about this graphic, but this graphic kind of set up like all the priority interventions. What do we need to take into consideration in order to have access to water? How we should take care of the different type of waste. And it's really important, the first minutes of the response to the emergency, how rapid and how effective we're gonna adapt our emergency response in order to reduce the risk of the families that are inside of the shelter. To finalize my presentation, I'm gonna, stop sharing the presentation. I would like just to highlight a couple of points. That is that on the last month we have on May, we have the IFRC hosted the first online pre-hurricane season preparedness conference where different contingency plans were updated with the feedback of the different national societies. So as you know, the national societies of the Red Cross, of the movement, they assist as an auxiliary position to the different governments. So for us, it's really important to update our plans, adequate our response, and see how we can better assist. We would like to encourage to the different participating people that are inside of this webinar to use the existing guidelines that are going to be shared by CDEMA, the existing guidelines that USAID have, and the existing guidelines that we're also going to be sharing with our host. So because we have collected the different inputs from the different organizations in order to see how we can adapt our emergency response in case there is a need. That's it from my side. And I would like to mention just, I saw in the question and answers one thing by one of the attendees before. And I would like, I'm going through it to see if I can find it. But I cannot find it right now, but it was someone that was mentioning to us that we should try to prioritize our homes as a safe place. Right now, our homes have become the security place for all of us and for the different families that are outside. So the last resort should be opening a collective shelter, but we know that we will have to do it if there's the need whenever a hurricane or a different type of disaster strikes. So that's it from my side, Andrea, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Denise, for that presentation and for a number of the key points that you raised on the tools and the technical requirements in support of shelter management. We are a little bit behind time, but I will want to give us probably 5 minutes or so. I see there is a question really and truly in the chat. It may have been tabled when in the other presentation. And I see also some specifically here. So let me just deal with those ones here. There is a question on wash facilities should be fully accessible. Example for wheelchair users and people with mobility challenges. Does the guidance include advice on this? I think that's one question, but there was also a question here that spoke to the matter of the Red Cross and national societies acting as really and truly, do the laws provide for activation of organizations like Red Cross, which are auxiliaries to the public authorities in times of emergency and disaster to address some of the shortage of trained public officers? So if you can treat with that in terms of activation of auxiliaries like yourself to support with shelter management, as well as wash facilities being accessible for persons who might have mobility challenges. So if you can just address those two for us, that would be useful.
Yes, so to respond to the wash facilities, we will take them into consideration. And it's not only the wash facility, we have different sectors whenever we discuss about the humanitarian structure itself, we have different sectors whenever we intervene. So we have the shelter sector, we have the wash sector, we have the PGI, which is the protection, gender and inclusion, and we have many others. So in all of these sectors that we have, it is really important for us to have accessible areas for the different type of disabilities that or people with mobility challenges may have. So yes, the guidelines, they does include that, and not only in terms of the structure itself of how is it going to be built, but also how we should approach to this type of different families or people so that they can feel secure and safe with the inside of the facility. And then to answer the second question, I just saw that Arlene Temal, who she works for the Red Cross movement, she has answered part of the question, and she has highlighted that as an auxiliary support to the governments, the Red Cross can be activated through the National Response Framework. So whenever there is a disaster, what it's activated first, of course, it's the, let's say, NEMA, the National Emergency Management Center of the different countries, but also the Red Cross, the movement, it's also already there. So whenever there's the need to do the different type of, because we're not only assisting in terms of managing shelters, that's not one of the main roles that we do. We can do that if that's part of the different type of activities that each national society have, but that's not one of the main roles that we have. But we do, whenever there's an activation of an emergency, we assist the different type of governments, and we encourage them to keep the staff that we're going to be having inside of the, let's say in this case of the shelter, they should be trained. So currently what we are having is online trainings for the different national societies of the Caribbean. Through our platform, we have a learning platform. So we are always trying to encourage to keep updated to not only to the national societies, but also to the governmental sector. I know that right now the Bahamas has requested IOM to have an online training because, you know, it's really challenging right now to have trainings. So what IOM is going to do is they're going to provide this training, online training, using the IFRC platform, because we have inside of our platform, we set up alongside with IOM a system of how to train people in order to assist this different type of needs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And I think there's a question here about whether or not, given that the COVID-19 could have some overcrowding and the need for additional shelter space, whether government should really include in the policy framework that incentives should be given to homeowners, such as tax breaks on building supplies moving forward to address the shelter needs. What is your thoughts? Yes or no?
Well, I have different thoughts. More than yes, because yeah, I mean, we should try to highlight to have adequate household items or NFI, non-food items, so that people can start rebuilding. But that's also risky, because when we might try to encourage people to rebuild, but we need to teach them how to build back better, not to how to go and build whatever you want, that's however you want. So that's risky, we say it like that. So if we're gonna share, let's say, construction tools, we need to share it with some type of advice, how you're gonna build back better. And in accordance to that, they also need to take into consideration the building and the construction guidelines that each country has. So that's one of the answers that I have for that question. And the other answer is that what we're encouraging is, since we depending on the size of the shelter, we encourage not to have more than 50 people inside of a shelter. We are trying to encourage to identify new areas so that they can serve as a collective shelter. And if you know that if those areas are not identified, or maybe they don't have many other safe spaces to put inside families, they know that in country they have the different type of humanitarian actors, where we can maybe, if they discuss with us, we can provide new areas to create different type of shelters, but let's say emergency shelters for this, because we need to identify new areas in order to avoid the overcrowding.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes,
thank you very much. I think that and as it relates to, well, you talked about the building back better, but this is probably something we can look at for the future as well, in terms of being proactive in terms of homeowners being able to make their homes much more safe. So thank you very much. We don't have time to go through what I call the top 10 things that you identified that would have been recommended on how the shelter should be planned and manage for resilience going forward. I call them the top 10, but there's certainly in the presentation that the participants can be able to see. And then to underscore the point that you made that there's no shelter without WASH. So we thank you very much for the presentation, and we thank you very much participants for your question. I will now turn back over to you, Crispin, for the final presentation. Thank you very much again, Denise.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and thank you, Denise. Right now, we will have a presentation of CDEMA guidelines for emergency shelters, shelter management, shelter managers, and shelteries during COVID-19. And the topics will include, among others, preparation of shelters for operating in a COVID-19 environment, basic screening of personnel in shelters, optimization of the use of PPE, etc. And that will be done, that presentation will be delivered by Captain Robert Harewood, Senior Program Officer, Preparedness and Response of CDEMA. Captain Harewood, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It's still good morning. Good morning, OECS colleagues, moderators, fellow panelists, and participants. I see over 260 participants online. On behalf of the CDEMA Coordinating Unit, I will be presenting on the CDEMA guidelines for emergency shelters and shelteries during a pandemic or epidemic, and this time we're talking about COVID-19. First of all, just want to indicate that this is the table of contents for the document. I want to say that you will be allowed a copy of the document. The initial sections of the document, sections 1 and 2, seeks to present a perspective by providing an introduction as well as an outline of the multi-hazard context of the region. We note that emergency shelters provide vital spaces for vulnerable or unhoused members of the community prior to or post a severe hazard impact. And recognizing that many emergency shelters in the region are facilities which were not originally designed as shelters, whether government owned, such as schools and community centers, or privately owned, such as churches or guest houses, etc. The ability to modify any shared living space to alleviate crowding or minimize physical contact could be challenging. One of the references used in this document is IFRC's minimum standards in shelters, and it reminds us that shelter is a critical determinant for survival in the initial stages of a disaster. Beyond survival, shelter is necessary to provide security and personal safety, protection from the climate, and enhance resilience to ill health and disease. It is also important for human dignity and to sustain family and community life as far as possible in difficult circumstances. So, we know that the importance of emergency shelters in the region was once again highlighted by severe destruction to housing resulting from major hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017 and Hurricane Dorian in 2019. And Ms. Mullen would have indicated some years ago what had transpired in the region to start this entire shelter management program. As we acknowledge the predictions for an above average 2020 Atlantic hurricane season and that the probability of a COVID-19 pandemic crisis could persist throughout, we also recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic will present a level of complexity to a national shelter arrangement, which requires compliance with physical distancing, good hand hygiene, and other transmission reduction measures for the containment of the virus. This in turn has implications for the regular operations of an emergency shelter. Notwithstanding the UNHCR's emergency shelter standard, which indicates that individual family shelters should always be preferred to communal accommodations as it provides the necessary privacy, psychological comfort, and emotional safety. It also provides safety and security for people and possessions and helps to preserve or rebuild family unity. But we do anticipate that in spite of stay-at-home orders, it may become necessary for persons to evacuate their homes in order to seek accommodation in an emergency shelter, either pre or post impact. And the reality is homes will be or maybe damaged or destroyed by severe storms, hurricanes, or other hazards. That's the reality. As a result, persons are always encouraged, therefore, to construct, and we note this over and over during our presentations this morning, to construct sturdy and more secure homes in accordance with national building codes. And this is so as to minimize the need for shelters and allow families or friends to shelter together in a more secure home space. However, acknowledging that this may not always be possible or practicable and compounded by the threats of COVID-19, the transmission of, and its associated protocols of physical distancing and other transmission reduction measures, we may see a reduction or limit to a person's ability or access to an external family shelter arrangement. Section 3 of the document provides the purpose for the document, and in it we assume that shelter management plans already exist within the region, within the 18 CDEMA participating states, but they do not fully factor in considerations for operations within the epidemic or pandemic environment. Using this assumption, the CDEMA CU proposes the draft document Guidelines for Emergency Shelters and Shelterees in order to outline the recommended procedures for emergency shelters, shelter management teams, and shelterees to support the participating states in their planning for shelter operations within a COVID-19 pandemic environment. The document therefore seeks to address the following: preparation of shelters for opening in COVID-19 environment, basic screening, occupational health and safety, safety guidelines, maintaining healthy conditions within the shelter, optimization of the use of PPE within the shelter, and physical distance in shelter settings. Section 4 of the document identifies the preparedness, the 4-stage shelter management cycle. And in this, we speak to preparedness, early warning, both pre-occupancy and occupancy. Phase 3 looks at emergency response, and Phase 4 treats to early recovery and rehabilitation. And Phase 4 also includes the closure of, or speaks to the closure of emergency shelters. And we note that emergency shelters should close when there's a visible or viable shelter solution, in place for shelterees. Assistance and services and service provision is phased out. This is normally linked to, for example, lack of resources or the end of some donor support. Safety and security threats have been addressed. Government decides to close shelters, or another transitional settlement solution is required. Within Section 5, we present the proposal, proposed set of guidelines, for operating in an epidemic pandemic environment. And this is because we know that homes will be destroyed or damaged due to the hazard impacts. And established shelters as well may also be impacted. And we've seen this across the region. So the shelter guidelines include preparations of shelteries for operating in an epidemic pandemic environment, basic screening of personnel in shelters, occupational health and safety, safety guidelines for shelteries, maintaining healthy conditions within the shelter, optimization of the use of personal protective equipment within the shelter, physical distancing in shelter settings, and the closing of shelters and returning to normal. And some of these would have already been indicated or mentioned by our previous presenters. Under general COVID-19 shelter guidelines, the document recommends alternatives to opening emergency shelters, such as sheltering in place, and we noted this several times this morning, and particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hotels, dormitories, and small shelters, fewer than 50 residents, should be prioritized over larger shelters. And large congregate shelters should be a last resort. We note that all shelter residents, even those without symptoms, may be exposed to COVID-19 and therefore should self-quarantine after leaving the shelter in accordance with local recommendations. High-risk shelter residents should be prioritized for COVID-19 testing and PPE if resources are available but limited. With respect to considerations for floor space, we note that compliance with recommended physical distancing practices for prevention of the transmission of COVID-19 will require more square footage per person or per family within the shelter. And this will result in decreased overall shelter capacity. And I think this is also mentioned earlier. Therefore, as national shelter capacity will decrease, participating states are encouraged to assess their current emergency shelter needs against their recommended square footage and consider the following: we know the IFRC minimum standards in shelter, settlement, and non-food items suggest that an initial covered floor area per person is at least 3.5 meters square or 38 square feet in normal times. And this will provide safe separation and privacy between the sexes, different age groups, and separate families within a particular household. In an epidemic pandemic environment, a minimum of 7.5 meters square or 81 square feet per person is being recommended by CDEMA. We also talk about temporary installation of partitions to divide spaces within the shelter, use of school where you can use separate classrooms per families, where possible, use of unoccupied hotels or hotel rooms, consideration for additional spaces which may meet the criteria, including existing work facilities for staff members, etc. So if persons can be housed within the work environment, then that should be considered as well. With respect to public health requirements, the recommendation is the placement of COVID-19 signage and safety tips in visible locations throughout the shelter. Things like knowing the symptoms, etc. We also want to be able to identify the spaces for quarantine and suspected cases within the shelter. Organization of basic health care within the shelter and clear coordination between shelter management teams and health authorities. Access to and consistent use of personal protective equipment, adequate supply of cleaning supplies, etc. With respect to shelter management, we recommended staggered shifts, training for shelter managers. I note this came out early, training for shelter managers in the identification of and basic screening of COVID-19 symptoms, safe use and removal of PPEs, and disinfecting the physical spaces within the shelter. Respect to, as we go to other, we're looking at gender and child protection considerations within the shelter, assignment of security personnel to the shelter, assignment of a registered health worker or health workers to the shelter for COVID-19 support, as well as psychosocial support, and the access to government COVID-19 hotlines or other government services as well. 5.2 speaks to the basic screening of personnel within the shelter, and we know this includes basic screening of staff. Screening should be done for fever, shortness of breath, etc. And unadmitted shelterees should be screened for exposure to individuals who were unwell and who may have had COVID-19 as well as underlying health conditions. Examples: respiratory diseases like asthma, non-communicable diseases like diabetes, hypertension, cancer, etc. Person conducting screening should be ideally behind a physical barrier, example plexiglass, or 2 meters or 6 feet away from the persons being screened. Screening an individual in 14 days quarantine or home quarantine as a result of potential exposure to COVID who requires shelter should be immediately placed in isolation within the shelter until arrangements can be made to be transported to a government isolation facility or GIF. Consideration should also be given on how to treat with a family where one person exhibits symptoms and others are asymptomatic, including issues which may arise if separated. Personnel who become unwell at the shelter should notify the shelter manager immediately and separate themselves or be separated from others. And the shelter manager should notify authorities of this case as soon as possible. And if the hazardous conditions allow for transportation of the person to a secure government isolation facility, then the shelter manager in collaboration with the local authorities should arrange transportation for such. However, if the hazardous condition does not allow for immediate transportation, the individual should be placed in quarantine within the shelter until the hazard threat passes and the all clear is given. With respect to occupational health and safety, emergency shelter management staff and volunteer guidelines include staff and or volunteers should not report to work at the emergency shelter if they feel unwell, have had contact with a confirmed case of COVID-19 and or have potential symptoms of COVID-19. Any staff or volunteer who becomes ill at the shelter should be sent home immediately, in inverted commas, if the hazard condition permits. If the hazard condition does not permit, the individual should does not permit the individual to leave the shelter, they should be placed in a quarantine within the shelter area until the all clear is issued. Adherence to recommended hygiene practices, wash and sanitize hands, etc., should be of paramount. Staff should wear gloves. Staff volunteers at high risk of severe COVID, elderly, and those with underlying health conditions should not be assigned to perform screening of shelterees. So elderly staff, staff with underlying conditions, comorbidities should not be assigned to screening of shelterees. Staff and volunteers doing cleaning in shelters should wear PPE given. Toilets, if possible, should be flushed with lids down to avoid drip splashes and spray clouds. We note safety guidelines also include shelteries should notify the shelter management team if they were in contact with suspected confirmed cases of COVID-19. Shelteries should walk with PPEs, masks, cloth, or disposable soap and also disposable soap and hand sanitizer, sorry, but notwithstanding this request, to ensure that there's social protection is maintained, shelters should also consider maintaining a cache of PPE in sufficient quantities, disposable masks, gowns, gloves, etc., to supply the shelter complement. Shelteries should notify the shelter management team if any underlying illness that place them at high risk. They must observe and adhere to the physical distancing protocols. They should be mandated, shelteries this is, to wear the mask within the shelter, and they should adhere to all other rules within the shelter. Regarding maintaining healthy conditions within the shelter, the best measure for preventing the spread of the virus is effective personal hygiene. Following our guidelines to maintain sanitary conditions within the shelter. Make accessible hand sanitizer, soap, etc. at entry points and throughout the shelter. Assignment of staff to conduct frequent cleaning of the public areas, washrooms, handrails, light switches, doorknobs, etc. Things that we take for granted. Have an adequate supply of supplies of for good hygiene, hand sanitizer, cleaning, etc. And the PAHO guidelines recommend that the cleaning of waste containers should include the use of disinfectant, cleaning with water and soap, and then spraying or wiping with 0.5% chlorine, a chlorine-based disinfectant. Common high-touch surfaces such as door handles, light switches, etc., should be cleaned at least twice daily with 70% alcohol solution. Floors should be cleaned daily or more frequently if spills occur with a 0.1% chlorine solution and air dry for 10 minutes. Bathrooms should be cleaned and disinfected at least once per day with 0.1% chlorine solution. Also, the use of household soap or detergent for cleaning first and then after rinsing regular household disinfectant containing 0.5% sodium hydrochloride, and then leave for 10 minutes to rinse. Any form of bedding, sleeping bags, blankets, sheets, pillows, etc. should not be shaken out within the shelter, but outside, downwind of the shelter and away from people. Bed linen should be washed twice weekly with chlorine solution added to the detergent. Respect to optimization of the use of personal protective equipment within the shelter. We know that PPE is in high demand and in most cases, low supply. All attempts that should therefore be made to optimize the use of available PPE. And guidelines for the efficient use of PPE include shelter staff should be trained on the safe use, care, and limitations of PPE, because there are limitations. Shelter staff should be informed of the proper application and disposal of the PPE, and all shelter staff, including volunteers, should wear the required PPE when operating within the shelter. Let's talk a little bit about social distancing. Now, physical distancing protocols for the prevention of human-to-human transmission dictate that persons should keep at least 2 meters or 6 feet distance from each other. Staff and shelteries should practice social distancing within the shelter as much as possible. And we know that this will be extremely challenging. Some of the guidelines for social distancing, therefore, include adherence to the minimum capacity of the shelter that will allow for correct physical distancing, therefore minimize occupancy to the shelter. Schedule staggered use of common places, avoid activities that bring residents or staff together. If queues are required, mark off 2 meters or 6 feet spaces to guide personnel in queues. We would want to create at least 2 meters or 6 feet spaces in between sleeping areas, and arrange for individual sleeping stations so that shelters lay head to toe. Maximize ventilation within the shelter if hazard conditions do so permit. And the shelteries will need to unmask for meals. Physical distances will be very important and has to be observed at eating stations. Also, be diligent in following the hygiene and food safety rules as follows. by keeping food covered, do not share eating utensils, and where possible, use biodegradable disposable eating utensils and containers, and the rest is listed there. Closing of shelters and returning to normal or regular use. The closing of a shelter should include the deregistering of shelteries to allow for any future contact tracing requirements. Persons deregistering from shelters should be tested for COVID-19 to ensure that symptomatic persons are not sent back into communities, but instead isolated. And isolation areas should be thoroughly cleaned and sanitized and inspected by health authorities before returning into normal use. And I want to conclude by noting that post-disaster resource availability may or will limit the ability to apply the guidelines recommended in this document. However, best efforts should be made to implement this guideline to the fullest extent possible. And some of the references are listed, well, all the references are listed here that support the document. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to present this document to you. And we now open the floor and back over to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Captain Hayward. Thank you for leading us, running us through the document. Again, we don't have much time, so I'm not going to go much into a summary. A thought just crossed my mind though, that we're talking about shelter management, and obviously that is, we're looking at discussing it at a domestic level. But I guess one of the things that could complicate the situation in time of a hurricane, you will recall, for example, certainly in 2017, we had a lot of inter-island movement, and the whole issue of a pandemic being on could complicate that scenario in case where shelters at the country level may be inadequate to house the people who've been affected, say by an extreme event, extreme weather event. So it's just something for food for thought as to how we would handle the potential movement of people between countries within a pandemic. So I'm not requesting necessarily asking for an answer to that or a response, but looking at the questions, there's a question: are shelter management and staff expected to undertake screening at shelters and manage quarantine areas? Sounds more like a Ministry of Health function. So that is one of the questions asked, and perhaps there's also a question about what would the response of a nationwide outbreak of COVID-19 now small island spaces with limited shelter spaces, and would non-medical volunteers be expected to respond? So these are obviously very similar, in nature. So you may just want to tackle that whole question.
I must say, I'm sorry, I didn't get clearly the question. To which question are you referring?
I'll read it out again. It says, are shelter management and staff expected to undertake screening at shelters and manage quarantine areas? Sounds more like a Ministry of Health function. There's also a question about what would be the response for a nationwide outbreak of COVID-19 in our small island space with limited shelter spaces, and would non-medical volunteers be expected to respond?
Okay, thank you. To the first question, are shelter management and staff expected to undertake screening at shelters? Now, the challenge is going to be that if you're severely impacted, a lot of the resources that would be required may not be so available. Therefore, it is recommended that persons working in shelters are trained. At present, we have security guards screening persons entering buildings for COVID-19, at least the basic screening. So we do encourage that shelter managers and staff that be working in shelters do also have that orientation training to be able to screen persons in shelters for COVID-19. But we also recommend within the context of COVID-19, that nurses, health practitioners are also assigned to shelters, either from the Ministry of Health, local Ministry of Health, or from otherwise.
And there's also a question, without adequate security and the limited capacity shelters will now have in light of COVID-19, how do we refuse entry to potential shelteries when the maximum COVID-19 shelter capacity has been met?
Well, you know, this is a very interesting question, and this is one that we have been talking about, and you would not be able to grapple with this in a discussion, because if you close the eyes and think about what we saw after the impact of Maria or Irma, or even Dorian last year, Abaco and Grand Bahama, where there's no place for a person to live, there's no home, and that person either leaves their home during the eye of the storm to go to shelter, or after the storm has abated. How would we, as human beings, turn a person out of a shelter and say, you know, we are full, etc., or otherwise? It's just not a humanitarian policy. So these are some of the challenges that we will continue to face, because shelters oftentimes are overcrowded in normal conditions. And if we add the COVID-19 epidemic on top of that, we may also have COVID-19 or shelters that are overcrowded, with the possibility of an increased spread. So these are things that we have to grapple with at the national level. This is where we would encourage the use of other shelters, and we know, and to be honest with you, some of the shelters that are already identified may be damaged themselves, and you have to find other shelters. I know in jurisdictions across the region, after the dust has settled, as it were, any building that was standing that could be a shelter became a shelter. Shelter managers were trained after the impact, persons who are now available to be shelter managers. So these are things that we always have to look out for, to ensure that persons can be housed adequately until such time as they can get back home and return to some sort of normalcy.
Thanks. I know we have to end in a couple of minutes. There's also a point. Someone asked about the security that will be in place in shelters for persons who are not compliant to the rules for effective management. You know, someone asked, given the delays in COVID-19 testing, how do we address this in the shelters? You know, well, yeah. So I'll let you answer those two, and we have to wrap up.
Okay. Well, thanks for that one. No, generally for shelters, and I know it is general, but oftentimes does not occur. There should be a police officer within a shelter, within a general shelter management, even shelter setting, even outside of the COVID-19 pandemic. A shelter should include a police officer and a registered nurse. So that in itself would try to alleviate the challenges of unruly types of persons coming into shelters and being disruptive persons, or even ensure that persons, that vulnerable persons are not taken advantage of. So shelters really need to include some type of security element.
Thanks. So I thanks for that. I think we have to end in a minute or two. So Andrea, I will give you the first shot, just so in case you have any some closing points, you want to summarize in any way, and after I will just do the final closing.
Thank you very much, Crispin. And I just want to thank all of the panelists and all of the participants for this session. I certainly enjoyed it, and I certainly also would have added to my body of knowledge, and I sure hope that I would have also shared with you as well. I think there are a few things coming out of the discussions that I would just want to highlight, just 5, because there could be several that could be highlighted. But firstly, to underscore the fact that we do have some arrangements that are already in place. We have model policies, we have guidelines, etc., that exist, and that they can be strengthened in some areas for a biological, dealing with a biological hazard such as COVID-19. In particular, the area of health and sanitation and WASH in general is one area that certainly can be strengthened. Secondly, to indicate that we want to consider our homes as as the first place of shelter, and how do we now provide or communicate to our populations about this to be a safe place that can be considered for sheltering during the time of emergency. The third point that we want to put on the table is that the shelter should be, shelter management would obviously now have to change, and one of the areas to control spread but still protect people is still limit numbers, but knowing that there will be challenges even in this area. But we also have to take into consideration several things such as personal protective equipment, testing, how do we isolate, how do we also deliver only essential services. And the fourth, and then the fifth point, the fourth point is that there is a plethora of documentation that is already available that can help you in terms of your own arrangements. The Dominica Shelter Guide was identified as a good example. There's documentation available through the IFRC, also through the CDEMA, and also through the IOM. And finally, communication. We will need to communicate ahead of time to the general population so that they will know what to expect, because the preparations start now or should be ongoing now, so that they know what to do as it relates to their own personal preparation. But if they have to address any matters related to the shelters, that they can do so, and also those who will be engaged in the process, they can do so as well. So I think those 5 points would what I would want to pull from the contributions that have been done today. There are several more, but we know that time is against us. So thank you very much. Crispin, back over to you.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks everyone for staying the course. Most of you have stayed on, even as we go into the closing minutes of the webinar. And well, I think it has certainly been a very rich session today. Many informative and interesting presentations. And there's been a lot for me. The key takeaway is that we are heading into territory that we may be heading into territory, or potentially that we have has been uncharted, certainly in the lifetimes of most of us. And you have the potential threat of being stuck between a pandemic and another more active than average hurricane season. But God willing, we'll be spared that double whammy. But all that said, it's clear that we're not starting with a clean slate, that there is a body of knowledge and a body of understanding and within the region, and hopefully we can draw on that and also continue to learn from emerging experience. That having been said, though, and in closing, I just want to say that to assure everyone that the presentations and the recording of the webinar will be made available in the coming days, or next week, or by the next week or so. So don't fear, we should have most of the emails on database. And in my final words are just to really thank our organizing partners. Certainly want to thank CDEMA, and very much also want to thank IFRC. Thank all the panelists for being on this morning, well, today. And Andrea, it's been a pleasure to co-moderate with you, and hopefully we can do it again. And wishing everyone a safe next few months and all the very best. Once again, thank you for staying on and participating. On behalf of the OECS Commission and all the other partners, thank you.
Thanks to everyone. It has been a wonderful journey for the last couple of hours. A pleasure.
Robert, I think you're still muted.
Sorry, I would say thank you as well, colleagues and participants, for engaging, and do have a pleasant afternoon. Thank you again.
Thanks. Audrey, Denise, hi, thank you.
Wish you all a good day. Thank you for providing us this floor.
Oops, we're together.
Have a good day.
Go ahead, Audrey.
Okay, good afternoon again. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. And I hope we don't have to use any of these in any emergency shelter for 2020. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Has always also been my pleasure, so I'll give you the final words, Crispin.
That's all I have to say. But again,
Crispin, was this your largest webinar recorded? I think we were just under 300 participants.
Yes, I think that has been, personally, that has been my largest thereabouts. I think there was one that came closer in July last year, but that's the one on. We had one on forecast-based action. Yeah, it was pretty high as well. But this has been the highest.
Yes, we went up to
So
79.
excellent job, right?
Yeah. So we
you guys have you have star power, you know. You have celebrity status.
I'm telling you, write that on the bio. Yeah.
So we're hoping that the review would justify the numbers, the participants. And I think so far from the questions that coming across and the comments in the chat, it has been good.
Yeah.
It's been very favorable from what I can see.
Thank you again, CDEMA and OECS, for chatting this course with us. I think it gives the region some reassurance of the preparedness mechanism that we have. I think people may have had some questions and other things, and listening and participating in this webinar would have given some sense of assurance that even if things may not sound as it should sound, but at least the conversation is being held, and conversation is the beginning of preparedness, actually. So I think that is reassuring. I think even at the policy level in our region, we will be assured that there are some consideration and there are some implementations, most importantly.
Excellent. And the fact is one of the sessions that we did at CDEMA, even with our own staff to help them in the coping, was the whole matter of, how do we sort of ride crisis? And really and truly, at the end of the day, one of the points that was made is that even for a sailor, experienced or inexperienced, the only thing that they really have control of is their vessel. So it really and truly in this situation, how do you really adjust your sails to be able to deal with the crisis? Because that's what you have. These things are coming at you. But how do you really adjust accordingly? And I think it is important for us to be able to share that there are things there that they can utilize, that they can build on, that can help in the coping and addressing the areas that that they have to face during this time. And so I think that one of the important things beyond this seminar now is to ensure that they get the presentations and so on, that they are able then to go through the appropriate information for taking the actions that will be required.
Indeed, but Sylvan, one of the reasons I'm very happy that you're on is that, no matter what framework we have at a regional level, it comes down, when the event occurs, it has to be implemented at the country level, right? It could be in a multiplicity of countries, but it really comes down to the national level managers to do this, right? Yeah. And national, local, and so on, right? And so, getting the country perspective was really, really useful.
Right, good. So,
and I could testify to Sylvan. I am telling you, you know how many emergencies we deployed him in the field, and the countries that didn't want to let him go. Want to let him go, so yes.
So he's a wanted man for the right reasons.
Yes. Wanted policeman.
Nobody police want people, but the people want the police now. So they...
Yeah, hopefully this will not be the case this year.
You're in a very unique position at this juncture in world history. Nothing to know the police.
It's pivotal.
Something that you don't know. Sylvan and I did some arrests after Ivan. Sylvan and I together.
Arrest?
Sylvan?
Yes. Audrey was made an honorary cop during Hurricane Ivan. She had pause of arrest.
So, Audrey, you have a very interesting history there.
So why I'm disappointed here is that you didn't have any video or pictures of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Late night. It was late night.
It's difficult. It's difficult sometimes to capture the moment when you are in the heat of it, and it happens so quickly. Where she had to had to secure prisoners. You know, I said, "Audrey, these are you."
She had to be deputized at, at short notice.
I think she was thinking about her own safety. Even if she had a camera, she couldn't take pictures.
Please remember, that was what, 2004, when cell phones weren't as prevalent as now.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed.
I was going to say it was a different era. Probably if it happened today, it would be captured, Robert.
Absolutely, it's captured. I agree. It does.
But anyway, but the other thing I want to just point out in closing, I think this has been a collaborative effort, and it turned out really well. So for better collaboration, we can get a lot done, and if we can enhance the knowledge base in the region, we can help to advance causes, and let's do it together, all right? So
yeah.
I'm really encouraged by how things turned out today. Okay.
Definitely.
It's really good to see
you very much
in this charge. Yes, ma'am. All right. Bye-bye. I'm heading to lunch that is not provided.
No, we might say it virtually though.
Oh my goodness. And thanks very much to Josette and Gail. I know that we started the process together. And then Gail came on and sort of took it from there as well. So thanks very much to Josette and Gail. And we know it's been a difficult ride, even in the mix of personal challenges, etc. But it was done, and I think that it must definitely be commended. So congratulations. I know you're very pleased. Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, Gail.
Okay, yes, well done, Gail. Well done, Joseph. Excellent. Yeah,
Thank you.
Joseph is handling this because we've had a number of webinars. For example, I'm currently working on another one, which is going to be changing one for next week. We've had a series throughout the summer, right? So we're keeping busy. But again, thanks everyone. Wonderful job.
Yes.
And let's do some more stuff together. Okay?
Yes, definitely.
All right. Okay, bye. I'm going to head out to lunch too.
Okay.
Welcome.
All right. Bye-bye.
I'm going out.